When inspiration strikes, it can be a doozy. But what actually inspires you? Hi, I'm Nika Waters, and welcome to the Boat Galley Podcast, your podcast source for answers to all your cruising questions. This episode of the Boat Galley Podcast is sponsored by Shambhala Sailing Adventures, offering customized learning charters in the Exumas, Bahamas. Sail her like you own her with coaching from Captain Suki Cannon. Contact her at captainsuki@gmail.com. That's Captain Suki, S-U-K-Y, @gmail.com. Mention this podcast for 10% off. My friend Ian Gifford from Sailing Totem just wrote a really awesome blog post that I'll link to in the show notes about cruiser karma. The whole idea behind it was realizing that when they were just brand new cruisers getting ready to head off for their big cross the Pacific passage to the South Pacific, they got answers to all their questions from being around other cruisers. The inspiration was incredible, and they're feeling incredibly grateful that they now get to do the same thing for others who were in the place where they were 10 years ago. A friend of mine here in Charlottesville, Michelle Damiani, wrote a book called The Road Taken: How to Dream, Plan, and Live Your Family Adventure Abroad. She and her family had taken a year and gone to Spello, Italy. She wrote a blog when she was out there that turned into a book. And this second book that she wrote was born out of wanting to answer the endless questions of how in the world do you do something like that? And that something like that is, how do you take your family and leave what is comfortable and known to go do something completely different? Michelle wrote about her family story, but also invited a number of contributors to share their stories, because the idea of taking off and doing something different is not just about one person's way of doing it. Our story, my family's story, is in her book as well. When Michelle launched her book at a local independent bookstore in town in Charlottesville, she hosted a reading and a discussion, and she invited any of her local contributors to join her as a part of the panel. I sat up there with 3 other women. We each read parts from our parts of the book. And each one of our stories is completely different, with the common thread of travel with our kids. But I realized that one of the things that is so easy to forget as we're living the life that we have, is that our stories don't feel out of the ordinary to us. So those of us who have been cruising or are in the middle of getting ready to go cruising, they don't feel weird. They don't feel out of the ordinary. But for somebody who's never made that decision, and for somebody who hasn't yet done it, it feels very, very otherworldly. And it made me think about, how do we get inspiration? We all get inspiration from somewhere, and that inspiration can be, and it doesn't have to be about going cruising. I would imagine there are probably a lot of people listening who turn to Pinterest when they want to get ideas for how to decorate their bedroom, or what to do in a kitchen remodel, or what to make for dinner. We all get inspiration from somewhere. Something sparks the idea. The idea that we learn from others and we grow from others. It's one of the things that I think is so hard for me to grasp when people talk about doing everything on their own, because I think every single one of us gets inspiration or an idea spark from somewhere else. What you do with it, that's totally up to you. But you might watch a movie or see a photo on Facebook and get inspired to do something. Maybe it's a book or a blog or a shared Facebook post or an Instagram picture or a conversation or a simple word in a conversation from somebody else. And whatever the source was, you were inspired. And I really hope that you take action if you get that inspired about something. And Carolyn and I podcast in part to document what we're doing, in part to share it easily with our families and for ourselves. We also podcast and blog in the hopes of inspiring other people. My words in my blog were not because I think what we've done and are working towards doing again is anything super inspiring, But I believe so strongly that life is more than Amazon purchases and trips to the grocery store. And I want to show somebody else that it's possible to do that. I love what Bien and her family are doing right now. In that blog post, she talks about Cruiser Karma and paying it forward. They're doing it by hosting seminars and answering questions as they're in La Paz. Carolyn and I are doing it on this podcast. We would love to share things that we're going through and answer questions that are meaningful to you. What helps? Does it help to talk about the places we've cruised? Does it help to talk about the practical tips of learning how to DIY, or what we're talking about in terms of downsizing our house? Does it help when we talk about how we choose anchorages, or just the sunsets that we're inspired by, or other cruisers? Let us help inspire you more by answering the questions that you have, because there's nothing dumb about any question you have. Let us know. What is it that inspires you? Thank you so much for listening to the Boat Galley podcast today. Remember, we've got episodes that come out on Mondays and Thursdays, and we are always happy to have feedback from our listeners. See you next time.